Hello everybody, Patrick here with our, I guess, the first online lecture of the module. So we've, as you probably know by now, we've ceased face-to-face teaching due to the coronavirus. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and give you the lecture online using the PowerPoints and my human voice. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to you about, well, what the central tenets of political liberalism are. So last week, well, not this week I suppose, at the time of recording, we talked about the political theory of conservatism. We spoke specifically about Thomas Hobbes and Edmund Burke, and I tried to articulate to you the core features of political conservatism, in particular classical conservatism. So we looked at some things like human imperfection, the idea that sort of conservatives were naturally sceptical. We took the ideas surrounding authority and the idea of paternalism. We looked at the conservative reverence for property, organic society. By organic society, this was the idea that conservatism, or classical conservatism at least, did not value the individual as much. So family, community, belonging, country, religious affiliation were considered to be paramount rather than individualism. Now, I did also make the argument that this very much changed with the new right, with the combination of, I suppose, market liberalism and traditional conservatism, as we saw espoused in the political theory and political applications of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Now, the other thing we talked about is sort of the conservative theory of change. The idea was that change should be small, incremental and piece by piece, rather than far-reaching and large. Also, we talked about tradition and family values, and the idea that the family was sort of the basic unit of society again. So roughly, those were the main principles of conservatism. Now, this week, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and look at some liberal thinkers. Now, the key text is a classic of the political theory, is by Andrew Haywood, Political Ideologies. I recommended it last week. What I'm going to do this week is I'm going to look at some core thinkers in the liberal tradition. I'm going to look at briefly at Locke. I'm going to try and mention briefly Adam Smith. I'm going to focus a bit more on John Stuart Mill and John Stuart Mill's book on liberty. I guess you could consider that a little bit of a case study. And then I'm going to look at Isaiah Berlin and Martha Nussbaum briefly. So I'm going to try to explain what those philosophers are talking about, but I'm also going to try to articulate what are the principal liberal virtues. And look at that, I spelled Wolfson's graph wrong. There you go. So by that I mean, what are the values? What are the values of liberal political theory? So remember last week we were talking about what is political philosophy, and in a sense political philosophy is, as Aristotle says, this is about the discourse about the nature between the ruler and the ruled. And so in a sense there's two kind of questions underpinning that. This is, how ought we to govern, and what type of society should we have in place in order to reach a form of justice, but also what should the government be like? What is the scope of government? And this becomes very, very important for John Stuart Mill, because he's got very particular ideas about the size of government and the things that government should be limiting itself to doing. The second point is that we should be trying to think of what type of values should individuals pursue within the governed society. Alright, so there you have it, the relationship between ruler and ruled. So to begin with, I guess liberal ideas have been there, you know. I mean, they go back to sort of Greek democracy. I suppose they came to zenith, I suppose, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Enlightenment thinkers and the promulgation of progressive values, right? And in some sense, this is what are known as human rights. So to kind of understand liberalism, you kind of have to have an understanding of what human rights are. And of course, the idea with human rights is that, remember, last week we were talking about Edmund Burke, and Burke was really, really skeptical about the outcomes of the French Revolution. He thought that this change was too far-reaching. He thought it was too radical, too innovative, and it undermined, I suppose, the natural hierarchies within society. Now, the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizens, the sort of the founding documents, I suppose, of that and the American Bill of Rights also is important there, but that is the sort of, I suppose, the founding principle of the idea of rights, and the idea is that the rights are universal. And that's important. That runs counter to what Burke is saying, and conservative political theorists in the classical tradition would argue for. Everybody has human rights. Everybody is entitled to them, if you like, right? Irrespective of where you belong, who you are, what your family is, what your community is, who your monarch is, and what your patriotism is. This is universal, right? So straight away you will see that runs anathema to Burke's political instincts, indeed his political instincts and his philosophical instincts. Now, I guess the what then do human rights look like? Well, it depends on the jurisdiction, I suppose, but we can usually see that it has some of the following, the things I've listed here. So you have things like property, freedom of speech, freedom of congregation, sort of religious pluralism, and of course, this is an interesting one, habeas corpus. All citizens guaranteed equality before the law, or I suppose the right to a fair trial. That's what that would be. And of course, that's not necessarily an Enlightenment thought. I mean, that's indeed sort of an English thought. Habeas corpus was founded in the Magna Carta, I guess. The other idea is yes. So this is an important part. So remember last week we were talking about sovereignty. So sovereignty resided in the Leviathan for Hobbes, or in the government, or in the way the government represented all of the interests of its citizens. So it was a little bit more of a top-down, although that's probably a bit of a simplification, but it is a form of a sort of top-down form of government. Here with sort of political liberalism we see the idea that sovereignty resides in the people, or it resides in the people, or those who represent the people, those people who they vote in. And the idea is that, I suppose the important point is the government should be subject to removal if power is abused, or it is not, if power becomes oppressive. So in a sense, that is what you call elections, right? Elections. Now, you might think that that's quite obvious, but in France of the late 1700s, this was a really radical idea, right? Because you had the divine right of kings, and individuals couldn't. Sorry, I got an email popping up there. Individuals couldn't. Or individuals or citizenry couldn't remove the king. Okay. Now, so moving on, I'm going to look at our first philosopher in the liberal tradition. This is John Locke, and the core text, I guess, would be the second treatise of civil government. And what's interesting about Locke, right, is that Locke does something similar. I mean, I don't think he's entirely removed from Hobbes, but I suppose he's got a more optimistic view of the state of nature. Remember last week, the state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short for Hobbes, as Hobbes famously says. But for Locke, in a sense, the state of nature is not necessarily a state of perpetual war. And if you think about it, in the state of nature, even if we have sort of mutual antagonisms and suspicions of each other, in some sense, no one is oppressed in the state of nature. Everybody's free and everybody's equal. I mean, a Hobbesian might say, well, yeah, that's only the strong survive there. But I think Locke is trying to have a bit of a more optimistic outlook on it. And in the state of nature, no one by nature is sovereign over anybody else. So in the state of nature, therefore, what does that tell us? It gives us natural rights. It demonstrates to us that, in some sense, in the state of nature, the human being has a right to, or has life, has the ability to be free, has property, or owns things. Now, all of that becomes more complicated when you try to formulate a government. But for Locke, that's, it's kind of, he's got an optimistic view of human nature, I think, and I think that's one of the things that you can think of when you're trying to separate. That's one of the things you can try and think of when you're trying to separate conservatism from liberalism. In some sense, conservatism tends to have a bit more pessimistic view of human nature, right? And liberalism tends to have a more optimistic view of human nature. Now, that's not to say liberals can't be pessimistic and conservatives can't be optimistic, but it's a useful shorthand, I guess, for trying to think about humans. So for Locke, sort of humans, can form government and can moderate government and can protect in others' life and others' liberty and others' estate. Now, so in the Second Treatise of Civil Government, right, and this is a really important document, Locke, well, he does what all the great political philosophers do. He tries to figure out what the best types of government are, and he argues that the best form of government, the most just form of government, is one of limited powers. And that's an important point. Right? That's an important point for trying to figure out how we ought to rule and how we ought to be ruled, and how we can come to a contract between rulers and ruled. So the best form of government is one of limited powers. And what essentially does that mean? In a sense, he's saying that what we need to do is, we need to limit power. Power ought not to become absolute. So ultimately, he's skeptical of the idea that there should be a concentration of power in the Leviathan, right, or in the state, or in the sovereign, right? And the best form of government is one where powers are made weaker or diffused, or powers are kept in check, or there are mechanisms in place to ensure that institutions or individuals or interests can't maintain power. So I guess the most famous one of this would be what, I think it was George Orwell called it the Fifth Estate, the idea that we should have a free media, which should ideally be able to keep the government of the day in check. So I guess the idea is famously was called checks and balances. You provide checks in order to mitigate the concentration of power, right? Also, what does he say then? Government, I guess, ought to be in the business of preventing harm to people. It should be in the business of promoting life, liberty, and the ability to protect and respect one's property. The question of property is interesting there. In some sense, Locke, in the state of nature, so the question of property is if the question of property is interesting because there was a bit of a sort of an overlap there, I think, with sort of the Hobbesian view, and that's the idea that property is one of the things that sort of binds society together, the respect for property. And if you have a respect for property, if you own material, then you have an investment in, well, maintaining it for yourself, and also for, I suppose, ensuring that there is government in place that will look after your interests. But of course, the most important point for Locke is that and this is key. I mean, this is a key democratic principle. If government breaks a social contract, people have the right to dissolve it. Now, the extent of that dissolution is interesting. That could be everything from you vote them out at the next election, or say in the American case, where we have the right to bear arms and written into the Constitution, it can be done through more militant means. Okay, so the next thinker. So before I move on to talk about John Stuart Mill, I do want to mention Adam Smith. Because Adam Smith is he's a key figure in the Scottish Enlightenment. I suppose the other big one that we would have studied already would be David Hume, and he's important to understand. Well, I mean, I think he's really important to understand generally, because he's a hugely influential thinker. But Smith, I suppose, was more of an economist than he was. He was a philosopher as well. But I think his primary influence is in economics. He's got a great book on the emotions, but I suppose his most famous contribution is, I think it was the Wealth of Nations, where he talks about the type of economics that liberalism should pursue. And I just want to talk to you briefly, note for you a few key features of that, because it is important for understanding the liberal worldview and what shapes liberal values. So firstly, there, as you can see there, I think Smith was a believer in the free market. So this is the idea. What I say there is laissez-faire. So the idea is that government should not intervene so much in business, in entrepreneurship, in markets. This is famously what's known as the invisible hands. In some sense, the idea is that you should have free markets. So if you want to set up a business, government shouldn't really stop you, I suppose. Markets should be self-regulating mechanisms. Now, this is not to say that Smith didn't think that government should regulate markets in certain instances, but in some sense, I suppose the best form of government is a type of a mixed economy, but it should have a strong free market. Right, and as such, businesses should be left to do things for themselves, and I suppose the idea is that the accumulation of profit, the pursuit of material gain, that is important because it creates jobs, it creates innovation, it allows creativity to take place, and what ultimately happens is that shares prosperity. So, for example, we think of something like, free trade. Famously, it is said that liberal democracies don't really go to war with each other, and it would be hard to find examples of that if you think about it. Have a think about that. And why might that be? Well, I suppose the answer Smith would give is because if you allow free trade between countries, then they have mutual interests. So say say Britain goes to war with France, say, somewhere near, not like it hasn't happened before, right? But if there is strong trading bonds between both countries, then that is unlikely to happen, because people, sort of, the French have interest for trading in Britain, and say British businesses have interest in trading in France, and ultimately what that means is that, sorry, slightly distracted there. There's a bin lorry in the background. So say the idea is, I guess, what I'm talking about there is the idea that if there is free trade between countries, you're unlikely to start bombing those countries. You're unlikely to start attacking France if half of your foreign investment is based there. France is unlikely to start bombing Britain if they have, students in universities here, or they're selling products to the British market. So in a sense, free market or free trade between sovereign nations is an important thing for ensuring prosperity, but also ensuring peace. That's the argument, at least. That's the argument. Okay, so the next figure, and I'm going to spend a bit more time talking about this chap. So this is John Stuart Mill. Now, John Stuart Mill, we did talk a little bit about James Mill previously when we were talking about utilitarianism earlier in the course. And John Stuart Mill, the text I want you to have a think about is On Liberty, which is a great book, really, and everybody should read it. It's a classic of political theory, and it's also very, very short, so you could probably read it in a day at a push. So do that. Now, generally, what is I will talk about what he argues on liberty. Right? I will talk about what he argues on liberty, but what I want to talk about first is sort of give you some of his more general ideas before I talk more specific. And I guess Mill is famous for, I guess he's a sort of a pluralist, and he says that what's interesting about Mill, I think, in that regard, is that pluralism is a good in of itself. Pluralism in a society is valuable. Mill argues that diversity, ideas, and conduct is good. Right? Society should be more plural. The more plural a society, the more interesting it is. The more plural a society is, the more, I suppose, the more things are available, the more freedom you have. The more business in a society, the more options you have to buy things. Right? The more ideas you have in a society, the more you can subject other ideas to scrutiny and to questioning. And in some sense, it's almost kind of for Mill, it's almost like having a plurality in a society is a strength of a society. It's the more sort of plural a society is, I suppose, the greater it is an index of the civility of a society and the capacity of that society to be robust and to flourish and to prosper. Also, this is why I suppose that Mill defends freedom of speech. He's a famous. Pluralism of opinion is important, but freedom of thought and discussion and freedom of speech is also important. Freedom of speech is a good example, I think, because the idea is that would be that, I suppose, the best combat for bad ideas is good ideas. That would be the notion. The idea that if there are bad ideas promulgating in society, we should have them aired, and if we have freedom of speech, that will allow us to contest bad ideas and to put forward good ideas. So it's kind of what Mill is doing is in the domain of thought and ideas. He's doing what the market. He's sort of expanding what Adam Smith talked about in the marketplace to concepts and ideas and values. So what we're talking about is a good society should have a marketplace of ideas where ideas compete and contest each other and overlap and bolster each other and consolidate each other, and that is best for society. And famously, of course, he said the bottom point here, I think this is an interesting one. He also says, very famously, beware of the tyranny of the majority. Beware of the tyranny of the majority. Now, Mill was you could say he was a Democrat, but the idea was that just because a majority says something is true, right? Although it should be the guiding principle of all democracies, it doesn't necessarily mean that it is right or just, and we should be mindful of that. I suppose we should be vigilant against the tyranny of the majority. Now, because of democratic politics operates on the idea that you vote and there's a majority, and the majority becomes the guiding principle of the society. But Mill says, okay, that's fine, but hold on, the majority also have to be kept in check. Okay, now On Liberty, we see, I think, this book On Liberty, where Mill espouses his theory of freedom effectively, and the best way to understand that is with the harm principle. Now, on liberty, he says, the only purpose which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Now, what's he saying there on that? Effectively, and this is, I guess, the classic exposition of what political liberalism is about, he's making a point there about the role of government, what government should be doing, the scope of government, and the extent to which government should be involved in the lives of its citizens. And it's a very clear principle here. It's a very, very clear principle here. The clear principle is that the only time a government should intervene is to prevent harm to others. Now that's very, very simple, right? Now, I suppose the complication comes when we try to figure out what constitutes harm. Could we say, for example, that, teaching creationism in school is a harm to children? Then should the government be stopping that in, say, in public schools, stopping the teaching of creationism, right? For example, where it becomes a bit more obvious, I suppose, when we talk about things like, say somebody's burglaring somebody's house or somebody's being mugged, right? Should the policeman, as a representative of the state, then stop that mugging taking place? And then you say, obviously, okay, well, yeah, that's one instance because harm is happening. But I suppose all we need to know for now is that for Mill, the government should not restrict human freedom. That's the point. The only point it should be doing that is to prevent harm. So there is still a utilitarian streak in Mill, but in a sense, for Mill, I think Mill is a sort of a utilitarian at the sort of the lowest level, but on the upper level, he thinks that what's not so much important is what the government should be doing is doing the utilitarian stuff, calculating the interests and the best interests of its population and reducing harm to that population, reducing harm to its citizenry. Whereas for Mill, I suppose what's important for individuals is self-actualization, right? And therefore government should not be restricting what human beings are doing, right? In a sense, he's kind of saying, do whatever you want as long as you don't harm others. If you harm others, then the government can come in and, I guess, engage in coercion or engage in punishment in order to reduce the harm in society. So I think then who legislates others' freedoms? Well, we do. We legislate we ought to respect the rights of others to pursue liberty. Right? It is good to see people choose freedom. It is good to allow people to self-actualize, because that gives us the sovereignty of the individual. And in some sense, this is again a form of, I suppose, of right. The individual has a right to determine their own path through life. As he says, and on liberty over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. The individual is sovereign. The individual is sovereign. Now think about that. That's a very, very far removed from what Hobbes is talking about, where the state is sovereign, where the Leviathan is sovereign. On liberty, it is sovereignty, or a great proportion of sovereign power ought to reside in individuals, and as long as that individual is not hurting anybody else, then they ought to be able to do what they want. Now we can think of lots of different examples where that's quite complicated. So I don't know. I mean, you might think of this in the use of illicit substances. So, for example, you might say, well, I don't care, you can take whatever drugs you want as long as you're not harming anybody else, right? Now, I suppose determining that harm is the difficulty, right? Do you do that on an individual level? So, say if you bought, I don't know, some illicit substances, right? Do you follow the chain of that back to its root source and look at sort of all the crime that emerges out of, say, drug trafficking? Or do you restrict it just to the individual who consumes it, say in the privacy of their own home, right? And I mean, there's no hard and fast answers to that, and I think for Locke that's a good thing, right? That's a good thing, right? These things aren't supposed to be easy. We need to try and figure these things out as a society, and as a society in process, and as a society in motion, right? Yeah, and there is one other point that I want to add here, so let me just highlight this for you. Yeah, so as I said already, it's interesting, right? Mill rejected utilitarianism of John Stuart Mill, right? Well, not wholly. In a sense, he's kind of saying that it's the government that does the utilitarianism. You know, the government kind of looks after. The government ought to look after pleasure and pain, right? You know, the government should be the one that sort of ensures that there should be a reduction in suffering and pain, and an increase in pleasure and desires. Fine, okay. However, for Mill, however, utilitarianism is too abstract, it's too neutral, right? It's too homogeneous, right? And what I mean by that is that, and this is Mill's argument, I suppose, that the utilitarian calculus it treats all pleasures equally, right? So Mill says the way individuals pursue pleasure is quite complex. So individuals have different orders of pleasures, right? Higher pleasures and lower pleasures, right? So this kind of famously what's known as sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. On sort of the lower pleasures, I suppose, would be the pursuit of food and shelter, and companionship would be sort of higher up, and then all at the top would be self actualization. So and I suppose none of those are necessarily wrong or right for Mill. You know, you have diffuse pleasures, but in some sense for Mill, self-actualization is itself a pleasure. The idea that you can individually pursue your own path through life, and you can exercise your own freedom, and you can pursue your own desires and your own pleasures, right? And that you can engage in thinking and imagination and empathy and compassion and all of these wonderful things, right? But the pursuit of those is a good in itself. It's a good thing to do for individuals to self-actualize, right? For the sovereign individual to find meaning in the world, it is found in the process of self-actualization. And the best form of government, the most just form of government, then for Mill, is the government that enables that to happen, right? So in a sense, we're seeing it's quite a mature, that's how I would characterize it, as a mature understanding of freedom, right? It's a mature understanding of freedom. Now here I say freedom is not caprice, and so what I mean by that is that caprice is the idea that I can do what I want willy-nilly, right? And that, you know, if I'm free, if I am a free being, my liberty is not unlimited. And in a sense, I think what Mill is arguing here, what he's saying about the nature of freedom, is that freedom is not easy. Freedom is hard, right? Freedom is not about pursuing, a plethora of desires. Freedom is not just doing what you want to do. You kind of have to work for freedom in the liberal mindset. In a sense, the idea is that absolute liberty becomes license, but we ought to maximize as much liberty as possible within a society. Absolute liberty, complete and utter freedom, is, I suppose, for Mill, has to be kept in check. But the question is, who keeps that freedom in check? And in this instance, for Mill, it's the government. The government. And now, the government's job would be to mitigate or impede the freedom of individuals if their pursuit of absolute liberty brings harm to other individuals. But it's a really complex question, that, right? Because what do we do? What do we do? I mean, when we are I don't know, imprisoned or coerced or under duress, or if we are seeking deliverance or redemption, that's when freedom becomes most of a value, right? So the freedom is not just freedom to do what I feel, right? It has to be mature, it has to be thought through, it has to be engaged, but it is still crucial, right? In some sense, freedom is the ability to do what one chooses, right? The ability to think what one chooses, right? Dagadankens and fries, what I got up there. It's like a Dagadankens and fries, a German, I think it's a German folk tune which was popularized as an anti-fascist song in the war. Dagadankens and fry roughly means, I think, thoughts are free. Thoughts are free, and the ability to think and to choose the things we think about is very, very important, right? So the idea that I can try and pursue my career, that I can pursue my own thoughts, that I can pursue the bloody things I want to buy, you know, that I can pursue my own hobbies, those things, it is really important that those things are you know, that plurality of choices available to a society. Because it's kind of like, you know, sort of Joni Mitchell song, you don't know what you got till it's gone, right? And you know, the best society, the most just society, is the society that government enables that to happen, right? So, you know, we're you know, in the modern world, like in the contemporary world, we're inundated with choice. We've got all types of choices, you know. We've got a sort of a pluralization of choices to sort of the nth degree, right? If you think about all the choices you have available on your phone and on your smartphones, you think of all the choices you've available to you that say people 50-60 years ago didn't, you know. You know, the choices that some of you wouldn't have had 100, maybe 150 years ago, such as voting, right? So I think what Mill is saying is, right, we have to be sort of wary of the importance of forgetting about the ability to have choice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the choice you take is good or the choice you take is bad, but the choices and the options available to you should be there. The society that makes options available is the type of society that Mill is talking about. Now, I think I'll just talk briefly about this chap here. This is a sort of 20th century philosopher, quite influential, very influential on former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, and he gives us two concepts of liberty, and it's quite useful. I would if you're interested in political liberalism, I would recommend you read his book. Let me just check what it's called. I think it's called 4 Concepts of Liberty, or 4 Essays on Liberty. You'll be able to find it. But he famously talks about positive freedom and negative freedom. And I suppose negative freedom is what the role of government should be doing. Positive freedom is the freedom to self-actualize, self-mastery, autonomy, and the cultivation of human dispositions, habits and capacities, right? That's, you know, that's so freedom is doing stuff, basically, the ability to do stuff, or the very doing of the stuff. Negative freedom then is something interesting. Negative freedom is about the absence of external constraints. So in a sense, what he's saying is that the government should be there the role of government is to remove constraints to the exercise of positive freedom, right? Now it can be a complex notion, that. So what I mean by that is that so negative freedom, the role of government is opening doors for its citizens, right? It's opening doors for its citizens. It's about removing. That's what a government should be doing. It should intervene insofar as it is removing constraints, right? Of course, now that is quite a complex issue, because, you know, let's say, take an example. Let's say say a child who is a member of the Jehovah's Witness religion, and he has to get, say, a blood transfusion, right, which runs against the ethics of Jehovah's Witnesses. I suppose what would be interesting there to think about is, right, who's got the right there? Is there a right to religious freedom? Should that be respected in that instance, or should the government be intervening in order to enable the future freedom of that, say that child, right? Should it be removing the constraints of the particular religion is dealing with, right? Why? Because should that be the role of government? Now, that's not an easy one to figure out, that one, right? You have to try and figure out a way of balancing the interest of everyone in that. But I think that's probably me trying to give you an example of how what government should be doing is in the job of removing constraints to people achieving their self-mastery and their freedom and their self-actualization. Now, this gives us this tells us this reveals to us another very interesting key liberal virtue, I would say, and that's what I want to do now. I want to talk about sort of some of the sort of liberal values and why they come, right? So I've talked about the role of government and the idea that sort of government for Locke and for Mill should be circumscribed, right? And by that I mean it should be, it should be limited, right? And as for Mill, the best form of government is the government that does not intervene in the pursuit of individual freedom, but it should only intervene if to reduce harm. Now, I think one of the common liberal virtues that we see is also what's known as meritocracy, and in a sense, when we were talking about Berlin, that's what we were alluding to. That is the value there, right? The value behind that is the idea of the absence of external constraints, or the opening. The government should be there for opening of doors, right? And what's going behind this, right, is that equality is I guess a liberal virtue, but it is premised on equality of opportunity, right? And if you see there on the right, you see that famous that picture that does the rounds on social media all the time, and it's kind of a useful visual aid for getting at what we're driving at here. So I suppose the idea in liberal theory is the idea of equality of outcome, right? That governments shouldn't be treating everyone as everyone the same in a sense. Why? Because people are different. Individuals want to self-actualize in different ways. Individual talents, individual merits. The government should be opening doors for people to cultivate those. And in a sense, this is very important. I mean, the role of government is there to, I suppose, to help individuals help themselves. Now, the extent of government, the extent to which the state should help individuals help themselves is complicated, right? So you could say for, like, in Britain, you have an NHS, right? And that could be seen as an example of helping individuals help themselves, because you have the government offering healthcare, which in turn provides the freedom for an individual to help themselves, right? So I don't know. Well, you can't really sort of pursue your projects and your ambitions if you're ill all the time, right? On another sense, then you could. Hi everybody. So, continuing on the last lecture, or the last part of the lecture, it cut out. So I'm going to continue on from here. So I was just finishing talking about sort of the example of the NHS and the government providing healthcare, and healthcare in turn provides people with the ability to do well because they have a they have I guess a sort of they have a welfare state which is there in order to protect them and in order to ensure that they have the best possible chances of doing well as they live their lives or as they participate in their political jurisdiction. I was also about to talk about probably examples of where the intervention of the state for the well-being of individuals might not necessarily lead to positive outcomes. Now, the example I was about to talk about there was the Volstead Act. The Volstead Act was famously pursued in the United States in the early part of the 20th century for a good period of time as well. But the Volstead Act was the prohibition of liquor and alcohol. And in some sense it was, I suppose, a paternalistic effort by government to limit the freedoms of individuals, but I suppose what eventually happened was that it didn't actually lead to a reduction in the suffering caused by alcohol. Indeed, if anything, it probably exacerbated it. So what a liberal political theory then is about trying to balance the correct role of government for ensuring that the individual has the opportunities to do well without harming the individuals. That's what the discourse surrounds. Now, continuing on that, again, the idea of let me just bring that over a bit there. So the idea is that, it's a kind of peculiar type of equality, meritocracy. It's sort of a strange equality. So it's not sort of, when we think of equality in a sort of average everyday sense, we think equality means homogeneity, right? In a sense, what liberalism is saying is that humans are not really equal, or at least humans are different. And what the government should be doing, or the government of a liberal democracy, is that it should be trying to ensure that everyone has the best possible chances of succeeding or failing. And equality of opportunity then is what the government ought to do, is ensure that a level playing field. Now that gets complicated again if you think about things like class. So so say if you're from a wealthy background and you have money to send your children to the best schools, does that then mean that then undermines everyone the ability to have the best possible education, right? I think maybe sort of a good example of this would also be something like legal aid. So legal aid is legal aid is what helps people have access to equality before the law. Legal aid would be, sort of providing barristers and solicitors and legal advice to individuals who cannot necessarily afford a greatest possible lawyer. So I suppose with that example, the argument would be that a government ought to provide legal aid for those who can't afford it, because it grants them access to justice. It grants them equal access to justice, right? And in a sense, that would be an example of the government engaging in what sort of Isaiah Berlin would talk about. The idea of negative freedom, right? So it's not directly impinging on what individuals do, but it is providing them with a leg up, I suppose. It's providing individuals with access to justice, right? And it ensures that there's a level playing field in where individuals have as many opportunities as possible to fulfill their individual freedom. Yeah, so that would be what I guess what the liberal theory of equality would operate around. It's not, I suppose, about equality of outcome per se, but it's about equality of opportunity, about ensuring an absence of constraints on the individual to endeavour to self-actualize themselves. Now, I think Martin Luther King gives us a good example of this logic. In his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, he talks about people ought to be judged on not necessarily the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. So in this sense, equality is sort of flat equality, where we sort of treat everyone the same, is unjust, but because it's treating everyone the same. So you could think of another context where you can't really have, say, a society, say something like disability access, right? So a government should be regulating access to, say, public buildings and institutions, say businesses, right? Because if you treat say someone with a disability, say someone who needs has a wheelchair, the same as you treat someone, say as myself, who doesn't need to have special access to institutions and buildings. But if we treat me and the person in the wheelchair the same, that doesn't really bring about equality. So it's trying to offer a sort of a finesse and a nuanced theory of government, right? And that then should govern what we how we ought to organize our society, right? Society should be governed by things we do, our actions, how we actualize our freedom. So as Martin Luther King said, judge not according to sort of, race, gender, sexual preference, ethnicity, but what a person can do. Similarly, at that time, of course, at the time of Martin Luther King, not long before that, President John F. Kennedy famously said in one of his speeches, "Ask not what you can do." Sorry, what was it? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And in some sense, that encapsulates that sense of meritocracy. And in a sense, for a political liberal, that's a good thing. The idea that you can self-actualize, or that opportunities are available to you, that you can pursue your own ambitions and your own aspirations and your own path. That is an important virtue for individuals to exercise and to respect, and for governments to try to enable. Okay, now I want to move on next to talk about another key liberal virtue, and this key liberal virtue is, of course, tolerance. Now remember with John Stuart Mill said that we ought to have a society where we have a plurality of values, right? And key to the plurality of values is that we should have to tolerate values that do not necessarily align with our own. We need to tolerate values that we might find unpalatable or distasteful, right? And again, individuals ought to practice tolerance now in a variety of domains of society. So that if we practice tolerance, in some sense, that allows us that engenders a more moderate approach to society, but also a society where people can pursue their beliefs and their ideas for business, and they can pursue their own forms of ownership and speech and congregation, assembly, right? In a sense, tolerance should be extended to all private matters. Now, when I say toleration should be extended to all private matters, in a sense, I think that is something that should come from the citizenry, or should come from individuals, right? Because you can't really, for a political, we can't really legislate morality, right? You can't really legislate morality. And it should be the individuals who are extending toleration to private matters. Now, I guess again, it's kind of trying to have a mature and grown-up understanding of politics. I suppose that's the aim, at least, because if you think about it, if you're on an airplane and a little child is crying all the way through the flight, you tolerate that, but you don't necessarily like it.
right? And acknowledging that a society is better if there are components of it that you find unpalatable, that then should provide you with a more robust and enduring ability to deal with the world, right? To deal with the world, right? We see, I think, we see this, like, for example, in freedom of assembly. So, say a group might start a protest, right? And while you might not necessarily like what they have to say, or what they think, or what they're doing, but in some sense, for the liberal, you ought to be glad that they have the ability to exercise that right, that ability to gather, say, or to assemble. I guess freedom of speech is a very, very important virtue as well. So and it overlaps with the question of tolerance. So with the freedom of speech, and I think the American example is a very, very good one on this. In some sense, freedom of speech, Americans have freedom of speech written into their constitution, as I understand it, at least, and that is, well, that's premised on the idea that you ought to be able to have free to say what you want, when you want, where you want, without government censure, without government intervening in what you say. And that's an important right. That's an important part of a liberal democracy, according to sort of liberals, because the idea is that, well, freedom of speech, say freedom of press, or freedom of speech in the press is important because it's a way in which we can hold those in power to account. Or it's a way we can, we can satirize or make fun of those in power. So in a sense, freedom of speech is profoundly important for equality, right? So for example, say you take a stand-up comedian who criticizes a government stance on, I don't know, say abortion or something like that. That's important for the liberal because free speech can undermine hierarchy. It can undermine the authority of those in power. That's the argument, at least. That's the argument. Again, so tolerance is a key liberal virtue. So that quote I have there is from, it's not from Voltaire. It's often misattributed to Voltaire, but it's usually taken as a neat summary of Voltaire's ideas about the freedom of speech. So Voltaire, the great Enlightenment progressive thinker. So it's Monsieur l'Abbé, je déteste ce que vous écrivez, mais je donnerai ma vie pour que vous puissiez continuer à écrire. Pardon my French. So roughly, I hate what you've written, but I would give my life to continue your ability to write. I hate what you say, but I defend to death your right to say it, is usually how it's formulated, I think, or something to that effect. So free speech is a hugely important linchpin of the virtue of liberal tolerance, and having that ability to have free speech not impeded by government or not subject to government censure, in turn enables pluralism. It in turn enables cultural diversity of identity, and in turn it creates a mature demos, or a mature society, a mature citizenry. That's what I mean by demos. And the corresponding virtue then is respect. Respect is hugely important for within liberal political theory. So respect firstly for individualism, or a respect of the dignity and autonomy of another person and their efforts to self-actualize, right? And also the idea that one ought to respect a diversity of opinions, whether that's of, say, a religious institution or a religious grouping, or a political grouping, or a minority, right? So toleration is an important liberal virtue because it underlines our willingness to accept opinions we do not like. So tolerance then is good for society, and it's where that thing we were talking about already with John Stuart Mill. It allows a marketplace of ideas to hold, to take place, to flourish. Why Mill thinks that's important is because of he thinks pluralism in society is a good thing, and we ought to arrange our political systems to reflect that. But also because debate, contest, argument is important for society. It keeps the society moving, if you like. It allows the society to be dynamic and flexible rather than becoming static, rather than allowing society to fall into stasis. The idea, it also allows a government to try out new things, to innovate, to try out new ideas, to respond to the events and challenges of the day. And in a sense, it's ultimately the bottom top point there is important, that tolerance creates it's a moderate virtue. And by that I mean it allows a society to be balanced between a variety of sectors and a variety of interest groups and a variety of pressure groups and a variety of values. So, for example, it again is an element of the checks and balances that I mentioned to you already. So, like, I suppose the idea would be that the idea would be of the fifth estate. The idea of the media would be a very good check and a balance on an excessive concentration of power. So in a democratic society, for Mill, for example, the idea is that we have we would have a mixed constitution. So, for example, in the United States, you would have a version of that where you would have, you'd have a House of Congress, and you'd have a Senate, and you'd have the President, and you'd have the media, and you'd have the Constitution and the Supreme Court. So power is not residing in one place; it's residing in a variety of different institutions, which can keep the other institutions in check. So that is, I guess, the important idea with tolerance as a key liberal virtue. Now, tolerance is also should be bolstered by other civil liberties, and liberal discourse is, or at least traditionally has been, committed to maintaining and preserving the civil liberties of individuals. And these are you could call them the rights, but you're also the freedoms that belong to citizens. That belong to citizens, not the state. The state can only work within a very limited set of parameters. So, for example, there you see some of them there: freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of congregation, assembly, freedom of religious worship is an important one as well. Freedom to join in interest groups such as a labour union. And now, one of the iterations of liberalism that I would like to draw your attention to. So, what I've been trying to explain to you is, I suppose, what's come to be known as classic liberalism. The ideas of Locke and Mill and Adam Smith. But we would have, I guess, another strain of liberalism, which would be we could find in the work of the social liberals. And there's a variety of social liberals. I got some of them mentioned there on the slide, so you can see T.H. Green and Martha Nussbaum, John Rawls, and I suppose social liberalism would be a species of liberalism which would see that I would argue that they ought to be a broader and more expansive role for government. Now, they don't think the government should be authoritarian or oppressive in any way, but they recognize the value of the state, for ensuring in individuals' freedom. I suppose you could say that the Essay of Berlin fell in that tradition as well. And what they recognise is that in some sense individuals are sympathetic, and we are motivated by a desire for fellow feeling in our societies. Now, the idea would be that the individual would possess social responsibilities, right? So the individual is still paramount, and respect for the individual, but the individual should also have social responsibilities and rights which would allow them to contribute to the flourishing of their society. Now, the state is still limited, but the task of the state should be to enable citizens to flourish. So I think Martin Nussbaum would be a good example of that. Now, Martin Nussbaum, very, very famous and sort of clever and brilliant Aristotelian philosopher, she offers, I suppose, a liberal interpretation of Aristotle, and famously she says that, you know, she likens the role of government to that of how Aristotle saw a plant. You know, so a plant is you know, it's kind of got its own structure, and it's got its own roots, and it's got its own sort of environment, but and it can flourish. You know, if it's left alone, it will grow, right? But that plant also needs water and shelter and all of the essentials, I suppose. And in a sense, that's what the role of government should be in some sense to provide the essentials. So the plant or the individual will be allowed to flourish in their own right. So the state is there to optimize an individual's ability to be responsible, but also an individual's ability to flourish. So still, I guess, a version of the meritocratic argument. Also, I would say that the idea, I think, an example of, I suppose, social liberalism in Britain would be we could see it in the NHS, for example. The idea that you have healthcare at the point of access, which the money is raised through general taxation rather than individual contributions. I suppose the idea there is that the welfare state, so it could be something like free education or free university education or a health service. It should be there to enable individuals the ability to optimize themselves or to self-actualize or to flourish and to prosper. And ultimately, I suppose we have to be circumspect about the state. We have to be naturally skeptical about the state's ability to solve everything. I think that's the common denominator of all liberalism in a way, that the state the state cannot, again, you cannot legislate morality. The state cannot force citizens to be good. What it can do is it can put the conditions in place to allow that to happen. So, in summary, then, I think of this lecture, what I've tried to do with you is to explain to you some core liberal philosophers such as Locke and Adam Smith and J.S. Mill, and then I've tried to explain that I've tried to use those as a springboard to explain liberal virtues, and thereby explain to you the core tenets of political liberalism. Right. So, I suppose with Locke, I think so as a summary of the main points with Locke, the idea is that the best form of government is a limited government, or a mixed constitution. With Mill, the key thing to try and understand is the harm principle, which we get in On Liberty, and the idea that the best government, the most just government, only intervenes to reduce harm. And then that led us on to a discussion of the different types of liberal virtues. So we spoke about tolerance, meritocracy, equality of opportunity, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly and congregation, and we concluded just there with social liberalism. So that's that lecture for now. The next lecture you will be looking at will be a lecture on socialism, which will be provided next week. Again, I suggest you could do no worse than read the chapter on this in Andrew Haywood's book and read on liberty. Read on liberty, even if you're not interested, it'll be good for you. All right. And for sort of preparation for the lecture next week, you could, you could do worse than also read the chapter in Haywood on socialism. It'll give you some of the key ideas, and it's very well written and very detailed. Okay, I will leave it there for now, and we will talk soon.